Hi everyone, here we are beginning our next chapter, chapter 9. We're going to use the things that we have been studying up in the course until this point to help us out with quadratic equations and functions. So clearly we're going to use some of our ideas of functions here. That's actually the very last section. Quadratic equations is going to rely on our skills with square roots. So let's take a look at just what this means. What is a quadratic in the first place? And I'll show you both types. An equation will look like what's here on the left. So a quadratic takes this form, ax squared plus bx plus c, and the equation we just say that it equals 0. The goal here is to solve. Now you look at this, and I just want to speak for a moment about the name. Like you hear the name quadratic and quad, and that feels like the number 4. The way we typically see quad used in English, right? Quad means 4. But what's up with this? And the idea is that the largest power of x is a square. So we've got x squared, x to the first, and a constant. And of course, the a, the b, and the c could be any numbers that will be told to you in the problem. Well, what's the deal? So a quad means 4, but we have a square. And really, it goes back to its Latin roots. If you speak Spanish, then this is probably a pretty close connection. The Spanish word for a square, that's a little bit off the screen there, but yeah, hopefully I'm spelling this. Quadro. Been working on rolling my R's for a few years, and I'm a bit out of practice. Quadro is a square, and so the quadratic, they spell it with a Q in Latin, but it's got those same roots. So this is literally the quadratic, literally means the squared equation or the squared function. All right, the square. Okay, so that's kind of the history behind the name, and much more interesting conversation if we were in class together. But anyway, there you go. So the equation ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. The function takes the same form, and that's a little bit blurry, so let me pull it over here. The function, we still have the ax squared plus bx plus c, but now we say f of x equals that to make it the function instead of the equation. Okay, so what are we going to do with these things? Most of our attention is on solving these types of equations. I told you guys just one section is on the function. So what does that mean? Well, the equation, we're going to learn these different methods to solve. There'll be a handful of different methods to solve a quadratic equation, and we're going to build up slowly, starting with the easiest, and then kind of walking through the natural logical progression. So that's 9.1 through 9.5. The function, we're going to learn how to graph these sorts of functions and what the basic shape of the graph is, and how the different values of a, b, and c can change the shape of that graph a little bit. We just spend the one section on that. It'll be 9.6, and that will be chapter 9. Fairly short, just 6 sections. Okay, so let's get into 9.1. We're going to learn to solve the quadratic equation by what we call the square root property. So it feels like it's got this big, powerful name. Turns out that this is the simplest way to solve in the simplest situation. So I'm going to begin with the simplest possible quadratic equation. Let's say we had x squared, and let's just say it equals 9 just to keep it all as simple as possible. Hey, if x squared equals 9, what are the possible values of x, right? what squared would give us 9? And again, this would be much more interesting if we were all in class together and people could, respond. But you might think, well, if x equals 3, right, then x squared will equal 9. Also, if x equals negative 3, right? Because negative 3 squared would be positive 9. So there's actually two answers here, positive 3 and negative 3. Okay, so let's see. Usually, though, we have, when we solve an equation, it's going to be more difficult than this, and we like to do the same thing to both sides to arrive at an answer. So let's work through it that way. Even though we can see the answers here, we can just think about them. What sort of steps would we take to do to both sides? So maybe the first thing, I want to isolate x. So if I see x squared, what do I do to this to cancel out the square? And well, we just spent this entire chapter on square roots and squaring, and we saw that squaring and square roots cancel out. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take the square root of both sides, and that will cancel out the square there on the left. That means I also need to take the square root of the right side. And you notice I left this space, and I did that intentionally. It turns out that the square root of 9 is positive 3, right? If I take the square root of 9, I get the one answer, 3. But I recognize there's also a negative version of that answer that's not going to come out when I do the square root. So what we do, when we take the square root of the number, we're going to put this symbol in front. A plus sign, and underneath it a minus sign. So that means whatever the square root of 9 is, I need the positive version and I need the negative version. There's actually two answers. And that will give me both these guys. So my next line I would say, okay, the square root of the square here is x. The square root of 9 is 3. That symbol, that plus sign and that minus sign carry down. And I literally read that as plus or minus. So I would say x equals plus or minus 3. And then I've got my two answers that I know. You might also choose to write both. Really, what this is shorthand. It means x could equal 3 or x could equal negative 3. Written separately, and that's perfectly fine to write an answer that way. But oftentimes you see it just with the plus or minus, but you know that means x could take both of those different values. It's just you don't have to write as much. You don't have to write it twice, I guess. Okay, so let's get into one that's got a little bit more going on. The types of things that you will see in homework. How about this? Let's solve 3x squared minus 8 equals 46. And the idea is solve by the square root property. Okay, so if we've got 3x squared minus 8 equals 46, there's going to be some work to do before we can even take the square root of both sides. And again, if we were in class, I might ask everybody, hey, what should we do first? And I'd be kind of looking for people to say we should add the 8 to the other side to begin. And that would be exactly right. I'm going to take a step back, though, and say really our goal, we want to isolate the x squared. We want it to become eventually x squared equals some number. And once we have x squared equals something, then we'll be able to take the square root and continue on. So our first goal is to just get that x squared by itself. We saw similar things when we solved radical equations. We had to isolate the square root, that sort of thing. Okay, so let's go for it. I'm going to start fresh just write this question again. So we're going to add the 8 to both sides, like so. And then we're going to divide both sides by 3. And we wind up with x squared equals 18. Okay, our first goal, our first task is completed. We got the x squared by itself. It equals some number. We really like that because once we have the x squared by itself, then what are we going to do? Well, take the square root of both sides, of course, to cancel our square here with x. So we'll take the square root of 18. But just like before, as soon as we take the square root of the number, we're going to recognize not only do we want the square root, but we want the positive and the negative version of that answer. And so we want this plus or minus symbol out in front of everything. Okay, this is looking really good. The square root and the square are going to cancel over here, and we'll have x equals. Also, we want to recognize, hey, square root of 18. I'd really like it if I could just take that square root, but 18, it's not going to work that way, but I can reduce square root 18, right? Isn't that square root 9 times 2? I got that perfect square. And so that 9 can jump outside and become a 3. And so, I have all the steps here. 9 times 2. And there it is, the 9. When I take the square root of it, it comes outside. And there I go. There's my answer. X equals plus or minus 3 square root of 2. Now you might choose to write those two answers separately. Nothing wrong with that. Instead of the plus or minus, you could write x equals positive 3 square root 2, x equals negative 3 square root 2. Those mean the same thing. But often, like I said before, most people, and I believe the book in their answer keys, they're just going to leave that plus or minus there in a case like this. Okay, I'm going to pause here, stop this video. We've actually only got one more example left in the lecture, so that will be in the next part. See you there.